The French have a phrase, joie de vivre, the joy of living. Alliance Française brings that joy through French language classes, culture, and community straight to you. Classes start May 2nd, but first, try a free Zoom class the week of April 20th. No commitment, no excuses. Early bird pricing ends April 17th. Visit francedc.org and sign up today.
I don't know if you guys can hear, but
I can hear.
Fire truck pulling out from underneath the Washington Post here.
Yeah, don't shit talk the DC water, man. Look what's happening there. They're coming to get you. Today on CityCast DC, the massive sewage spill in the Potomac became a huge news story and a national political battle. But it is not like the story started when the Potomac interceptor pipe burst in January. My guest, Washington Post investigative journalist Aaron Davis, is out with a big report on the failure and finds it goes back years. It is an absolutely infuriating read, with DC Water asking for permission to repair the pipe and the Park Service taking years to even evaluate the request. Davis is here to tell us what he found. It doesn't make anyone look good. Today is Thursday, April 16th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Aaron, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
All right, so the Potomac sewage spill was massive DC news for months in the winter. And as of now, emergency repairs are complete, which was just in time for you to do a great big investigation about how we got here. So most people didn't think about the Potomac Interceptor until January. When does your saga begin?
Yeah. And you're right. I mean, here we are, 60 days out, and it took 54 days for them to finish the repairs and to get it working again. So
it's a lot of sewage.
A lot of sewage, yeah. So we tried to look and how did this come about? You know, when in January, when there was the spill, we were all asking the same questions at the press conferences. How did this happen? What did you know about that area of the pipe? Had this been a problem? What did the inspection reports say? And DC Water didn't say a whole lot at first. They did ultimately have several community meetings and talk about what they knew. But, we found that they really only did tell part of the story. And, if you look back in the documents, we were able to actually scrape from their website about 2,600 public documents and to begin to try to piece together a timeline of what happened with this area of the Potomac Interceptor. And for the uninitiated, this is a huge pipe, right? 60 inches wide, and it runs all the way from Dulles Airport down to DC and the sewage treatment plant there. And we found that way back in 2017, 2018, DC Water, the utility responsible for this, knew there was a problem in this section. Specifically, just a little bit upstream, they were really concerned where they saw rebar, the metal frame in this concrete pipe, dangling, falling out of the concrete itself, dangling into the sewage stream. And so they said, we need to repair this section. They went to the National Park Service.
Why did they have to go to the National Park Service?
So the National Park Service controls this land. It controls, in fact, I didn't realize this until we started reporting on it, controls a fair amount of all the land that the infrastructure that the DC Water is built upon. And so if you think about, kind of makes sense, right? And that the Potomac River runs through our whole area. So much of the piping system runs along that until you reach down to Blue Plains. And also, you might not realize living in the DC area, but that Blue Plains, that treatment facility, is one of the biggest advanced treatment facilities in the entire world. A huge basin of water from Virginia, from Montgomery County, from Prince George's County, all flows into that treatment plant so that it's treated there and then re-enters the river south of DC and south of where we get our drinking water. And so, that was why they had to go to the Park Service. Specifically, they go to the Park Service because they control the land where this is buried, and they have to do what's called a National Environmental Policy Act review, or a NEPA review, because they could to disturb this federal land.
And those things take 2-3 weeks, right?
If they took 2 or 3 weeks, we wouldn't be here talking.
So what did they find when they did this review?
In 2018, DC Water goes to the Park Service and they say, "We don't think this is gonna be too big of a problem. That we think that this will only be minimally disruptive to this area of parkland, and so we ask for the simplest kind of environmental review." And I was not familiar with this term of art, but it's called a categorical exclusion. And so they said, "Just exclude us from the bigger environmental reviews, and we'll go forward." Now, experts I talked to say this process can even just deciding whether to give them that kind of waiver can last about 6 months. Well, we found that really from the get go, this project kind of fell off the rails because by 2019, in DC water documents say that this project is 266 days behind schedule. They still haven't been able to get a review from the Park Service and approval to determine if they're going to have this waiver or not. This goes on for like a year. They finally get a preliminary approval, and then like another year goes by. Then we're into the pandemic. They do some advanced engineering studies and find that there's going to be more impacts than they said originally. And honestly, that starts a whole new problem because the Park Service then says we have to actually do a deeper and more intensive environmental review. We can get into all this, but basically in 2021, the process starts all over again, and they go and have to what was once a 100-page report now becomes like a 300-page report, and that's only part of the story.
So, what were some of the things they thought would be the impact of repairing the sewage interceptor?
Yeah. So the Park Service was initially asking questions about um, the and disruption of vegetation. And there's something I first heard of in this reporting called the buttercup scorpion weed, which
It's
is
one of my favorite weeds.
there you go. So it's got a light blue flower that blooms in the spring, and the rest of the time you would think it's just a weed. And this is apparently prevalent along this area of the C&O Canal. And this whole area where it lives and thrives is the only place in the world is apparently from like West Virginia to Delaware and Maryland down to North Carolina. But there's in some pockets along the C&O Canal a ton of this stuff. And then there's another thing, this the trees, of course. This is parkland. They want to preserve the old growth trees. And then there's just a lot of joggers and bikers and people who use this area along the C&O Canal. So that was a concern.
And a bat. There was a bat.
Later, yes, the bat comes in later. So then when they say, when DC Water comes back to the Park Service in 2021 and says, "Here's the real schematic of what we want to do and exactly how we want to do it," the number of trees they're going to impact actually goes up significantly. It goes from like maybe 3 in one of the earlier versions they talked about to 260 trees.
Mm-hmm.
And Park Service is like, "Whoa, that's a lot of trees." We need to then, talk about how we're going to mitigate that loss of tree canopy, but also if we're cutting down that many trees, we might lose habitat for something called the northern long-eared bat. And this little bat doesn't actually live in trees usually, but they say it could be taking a nap in the trees. It could be hanging out during the day in the shaggy bark of the trees along the C&O Canal. And so that's off this discussion about should we cut down the trees? When should we cut down the trees? We could cut them down in wintertime when the bats aren't there, and then they won't inadvertently be cut down with the trees. So yes, the scorpion weed, the northern long-eared bat, and so many other things that eventually come into play here in this whole debate.
So, in the course of your reporting, you write that you reviewed more than 2,600 public utility documents. And this is DC Water going back and forth with the Park Service, other agencies, and all of these reasons for delay are coming up. All of these procedures that take time are coming up. I'm curious if you can characterize the tone of these things. Like, was anybody saying, like, listen, dudes, if you don't let us do this, we could have a spill of like hundreds of Olympic pools worth of sewage into the river?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because way back in 2018, the first real like big document that you see on all of this is in the fall of 2018. And DC Water writes at that very moment, says, we're concerned about this corrosion. We're concerned about, this particular area where we see that rebar, but really there's a whole like 3/4 mile stretch we need to as systemic corrosion. And if we don't fix this corrosion now, it could lead to widespread, I should get the quote out, but actually a catastrophic is the word that they use, spill of wastewater into the groundwater, into the water table, and potentially into waterways, and therefore meaning the Potomac River.
And that seems to me like the bureaucratic correspondence equivalent of shouting.
Yeah, I think I was trying to discern in some of the reporting here, is this just kind of like the boilerplate language that you might use to say, hey, this is important, pay attention, and don't make us do this big environmental review? Or were they really saying we have a potential problem? And, over the next couple of years, you see it more and more, and some of the private dialogue that isn't necessarily even in the public records, but other ones we're able to obtain. And there's like meeting minutes in 2020, 2021. I say we're still really concerned about this degradation of the pipe. This is still a big concern for us. And it doesn't seem to spark urgency on the side of the Park Service. And, I think one thing that as there's more investigation and discussion about this in the months to come, what urgency was there on either side of the equation here is still something that I think, is going to come out in documents that we can't even see yet.
Wait, why can't you see them?
Well, I mean, we've put in public records requests
Of
for
course.
this stuff, but a lot of those can take months or years to fulfill. We were able to piece together this looking largely at meeting minutes, looking at agendas, looking at presentations that were given to the executives inside DC Water. DC Water at a couple points shared documents with us as we said, help us explain, help us understand what we're seeing here. And so they'd share something else and say, here's more of what the story that you're looking at. So that was helpful, but there are no doubt thousands and thousands of pages dealing with this very issue because there were monthly meetings between the Park Service and DC Water for like 7 years on this, it sounds like, from all my reporting. And so there are many meeting minutes and many things that we just don't know what were said. I can say that that there was that point of urgency back in 2018. There were other points later on. I think one interesting part of this also comes in around 2024, which is, this whole process is still ongoing. So they restart this environmental review process in 2021. And so in 2021, and we can talk about this in a minute if you want, but the time limit they're supposed to can do these reviews under. But by 2024, they're doing another round of video inspections inside the pipe. And they realized that the rebar that they saw hanging in there in 2018 and then again in 2021 is now completely washed away. And so the DC Water says at that point in time to the Park Service, we really have an urgent situation here. We need to immediately do these fixes because we're concerned about failure and collapse of this pipe. They said that in 2024. And it takes another 7 months for the Park Service to agree to even the emergency repairs in the 800 feet of the pipe upstream of where ultimately collapses. And on January 19th, when the pipe does collapse downstream from there, the Park Service is still in the process of doing the environmental review of that section and hadn't approved it yet.
This is Sister Nancy Downing, CEO of St. Anne's Center for Children, Youth, and Families. For over 160 years, St. Anne's has provided children, young mothers, and families across the DC area the emotional, educational, financial, and loving support they need to grow in health and happiness. I'd like to invite you to Hope Blossoms, our annual fundraising gala, on May 13th from 6 to 9 p.m. at the Columbia Country Club, 7900 Connecticut Avenue in Chevy Chase, Maryland. It's an evening to celebrate our families and thank everyone whose generosity has made this mission possible. As our Director of Clinical Social Work, Nina Harvey, says, at St. Anne's, we meet women where they are, affirm their dignity, and help them recognize the strength they already carry within themselves. If you'd like to attend Hope Blossoms, volunteer, or support St. Anne's in other ways, please reach out to Ellen Toops at etoups@stanns.org. We would love to see you at Hope Blossoms on May 13th from 6 to 9 p.m. at Columbia Country Club, 7900 Connecticut Avenue in Chevy Chase, Maryland. See you there.
So I have to tell you about my night at Katsumi. Walking in feels like walking into a movie. The lighting and the space and the energy, everything just feels intentional. Like somebody designed the entire thing to make sure that you feel like the main character when you're there. Katsumi on 14th Street is a modern Japanese restaurant led by Michelin-starred chef Masaki Ushino. And the food truly matches the moment. I'm talking about premium sushi that tastes like it was made just for you, a sake program with rare pours you're not going to find anywhere else, and a seasonal menu that feels like it was written specifically for this night. 2025 James Beard semifinalist Andra Johnson is running the dining room, and that means that every single detail feels accounted for from the moment you walk in. Katsumi is the kind of place you are going to want to go back to again and again, especially to bring somebody that you're trying to impress. So reserve your table now at katsumidc.com. That's KATSUMIDC.com.
Spring is here, and it is finally that rare time of year in DC when it's neither too cold nor too hellishly hot to open your windows. So don't miss out. Window Nation's The More You Buy, The More You Save sale is going on now. You could save up to 50% off all windows for your home. Window Nation's installation crews finish the job in 1 day or less, so you can enjoy the breeze with minimal disruption. Best of all, they offer a lifetime warranty on all their windows, so you can relax knowing your home is protected far into the future. Hurry! This sale ends soon. Schedule a fast free consultation now at windownation.com. So it's funny, this is, it is on one hand such a specific local story, right? A pipe bursts in someone's town and spoils the river in that town, but it really dovetails with a big national conversation that is going on about, why does it take so long to do stuff, to build stuff? And is the nature of environmental regulation such that it's really preventing a lot of things and paradoxically leading to even bigger disasters? That was a bit of the undertone when the spill had happened and President Trump went up and decided he was going to blame Wes Moore, the governor of Maryland, and the D.C. government. Then there was finger pointing right back saying, we've pointed this out before. In your reporting, I hate to be so simplistic, but did you come down with an answer on who's right in the finger pointing?
I'm not an expert in this environmental law, so I did try to talk to folks who were involved in the permitting processes and the steering councils under both President Trump and President Biden, and local experts that would really know this law. And I think if the very quickest takeaway in all of this is a quote that we used in our story, which said, "This was a process gone wrong." That it's not supposed to take this long. This environmental review process is not supposed to be inherently a impediment to doing construction, especially when you're talking about infrastructure repairs and critical infrastructure. It's supposed to be a process by which an agency says, okay, how do we mitigate this and how do we go forward? And, there's three buckets inside this NEPA world. And the first is that categorical exclusion, the waiver kind of, if we will. The second is this environmental assessment. And the third is something called an environmental impact statement, which can take years. Where they arrive in 2021 is the idea that we need to do an environmental assessment. And an environmental assessment way back in 2017, President Trump, when he first comes into office, signs an executive order saying this environmental assessment should only take a year. And then they spend a couple of years debating the particulars of this. And in the Federal Register in 2020, it's published exactly as that, saying it should only take a year. And they actually put in the register what they say should be the beginning point of that one. This can be a point of debate. When do you start the clock running? And they say the clock should start running when you determine that you need to do an environmental assessment. And then under Biden, in concert with some changes in Congress, they codified that into law. And they set up this kind of three-test scenario. And the earliest of those three, and for all of our purposes, it stays the same. It's still the point in time when the agency says they need to do the review. Mm-hmm. We know from the documents we looked at that is actually September of 2021. There's an email from the Park Service to DC Water saying, we've looked at everything and this should be an environmental assessment. Well, the problem is that from our reporting, the Park Service didn't see it as the clock is starting at that point in time. They said, we can only start that 1 year clock when we have an exact plan of what's going to be done. Mm-hmm. And so every time they asked a question, DC Water came back and proposed a change to the plan. And then Park Service says the clock started over with a year.
This is making my head hurt.
This goes on and on for years. The experts we spoke to said that's not the way it's intended to work. It's normal for the process to be iterative, that you're going to have to make changes to accommodate things during this review process. That should not change the overall scope of the process taking a year. So you're right. In the grandest takeaway step back of all of this, it's kind of one of those awful examples of where the process, where the bureaucracy bogs down something that, you know, public officials saw needed to happen and needed to happen for a greater good of public health. And in this case, it's kind of one person I spoke to said it's kind of a tragedy. It's really ironic that an environmental review, for all these good purposes to have an environmental review, here ended up taking so long that it led to this environmental and ecological catastrophe.
So it seems like from what you're saying that there's sort of two things. One is the process itself, which may not be that great, but two is that they didn't even follow their own rules about how long things are supposed to take.
Yeah, I think that's the takeaway is that there were rules on the book, all the experts we spoke to, so that they were not following the spirit and letter of the law here in this case. Park Service, their position is that, this was really DC Water's fault. They kept changing the plan, and so they kept having to restart the process.
But they were only changing the plans to accommodate the Park Service's concerns.
Largely, yes. I mean, there's a couple other times there's Maryland or other folks that necessarily look at this during the course of the process. And they're also trying to answer all their questions. One other point that we really didn't get into too much in our story for the paper, but I think is important to think about in this context is that DC Water had asked to do these repairs on this section in 2018. They'd asked to do other repairs on another section in 2017. And so both of those processes go forward for 2 or 3 years. And it's in that 2021 decision when they say we need to do this environmental assessment. One of the big reasons why was they said we need to consider these two projects together. Well, the Park Service had 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020 to look at that, but only in 2021 did they say we need to look at these two things together. And that's because of a part of this federal law that says if they're supposed to accomplish the same thing, and here largely they were trying to fix this pipe, that they need to take all of the project, all of the construction you're going to do and look at it in totality and look at its environmental consequence. And so that process, looking at these two different areas in tandem, changed the whole calculus. You weren't just now looking at a couple thousand buttercup scorpionweed plants in the park that
Oh, no.
You're talking about 138,000 buttercup scorpion weeds that also can need to be mitigated for their loss in another part of the pipeline. You're talking about bringing in, of course, more of the bat habitat. All this stuff starts compounding and really complicating the whole approval process.
So is anyone going to lose their job over this?
Your guess is as good as mine. I think that, what I do know that the advocate groups want to see is a real independent investigation and to see, what do the documents show? What do we even fully know the full ecological ramifications here? There's been this number that's given by DC Water. Some environmental groups even question if that's accurate. But here, there's very little mechanism in the process right now to hold either side to real account to how this bureaucracy kind of fell apart.
Last question. Now that there's been this sort of visceral object lesson, do we know if they've discovered that there are other pipe areas that need fixing, and or is there any evidence that people are acting with a little more urgency about that sort of stuff?
Yeah, a couple points on that. One, DC Water said we're going to go look at the entire interceptor line now and really reevaluate the whole thing. And part of that is because it's not just this corrosion, but it was the way that the pipe became blocked that makes them wonder if there's things buried that they just don't know about that could be impacting this. And there were these big boulders, 3 feet wide in some case, that fell into that section. And that created like a plug, basically. If you want to get really graphic, that's what backs up the sewer and sends it up through a manhole, kind of like a geyser. And that's what begins to run out over the parkland into the Potomac. And so the experts said that the DC Water engineers themselves said there really should have been nothing bigger than, say, 3 inches in diameter in that clean fill that was put on top of that pipe. So over time, we did one of these big boulders, create a stress point, a pressure point on top of that pipe that combined with the corrosion in this pipe lead to the failure. So they don't know other places in the pipe, in that 50 miles of pipe, where maybe the blasting where they had to conduct the blasting to bury the pipe, that they just backfill with boulders in other places. And so they're doing sonar and more high-tech testing to see what's around the pipe in these other areas. But there is another part to bring out, which is that DC Water engineers briefed executives of DC Water in the fall of 2024, according to a document we saw, and said there are a lot of other concerning parts to this interceptor. In fact, there's a map that they showed on a slide projection. It had 20 other places where the corrosion that they'd seen through camera investigations was worse than in the spot that ruptured. And so what is being done on those 20 other spots? How are they prioritizing those? What are they doing to mitigate that in any urgent way? All of that's still to be determined.
Is there a map of where those 20 other spots are?
There, we put it out in there with our story. It's online, and there's a more graphic version you can link to from the story, the actual slide presentation from November of 2024.
Well, I hope you don't live on top of one of those areas.
Yeah. Well, and it's something for the whole region to be concerned about, because the one thing they say in that slide is that there's no redundancy in this pipe. One of the strange things is that they were studying, and they knew about the potential for the failure in this spot, and they knew there's a canal running right beside it. They were actually quite lucky that the break happened where it happened, because they could turn the historic C&O Canal into an open-air sewer for 2 months while they then drained that pipe, dried it out, cleaned it, fixed it, and then began running the water through it again, the wastewater. There are so many other places through the middle of Virginia, through actually even under the Potomac River itself, where there's no side, canals sitting there next to it to temporarily divert the wastewater should it fail like that somewhere else.
Aaron, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
That's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We will be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.